Hey there, friend. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, let's take a second, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the perfect time. It helps more than you know, and lets me keep telling you these strange, forgotten, and oddly relaxing stories from the past. Also, I'm always curious, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. What city? What country? And what time is it right now? 2 a.m.? 3:15? I love seeing how far these stories travel and how many people we're drifting off together with. Alright, tonight's journey will take us deep into the medieval world. But not into its kings or castles, not its wars or plagues. No, tonight we're chasing something else entirely. We're going after the sensation elusive, mysterious, and deeply human of what made our ancestors feel high. Not necessarily in the modern sense of the word, but high as in altered, ecstatic, distant from the grind of their lives. Because medieval people, despite what you might imagine, weren't just dour peasants shuffling through fields or monks quietly copying manuscripts. They were seekers, craving sensation, escape, divine visions, forbidden pleasures, anything that would lift them beyond their skin, their roles, their pain. And what they turned to for that escape was as bizarre, beautiful, and often terrifying as the age itself. Let's begin not with drugs, but with the mind. The holy trance. In cloisters and forests, in icy mountain caves and candlelit cathedrals, holy men and women practiced mortification fasting, whipping, self-inflicted wounds, not to punish themselves, but to reach transcendence. Saint Catherine of Siena reportedly ate nothing but the Eucharist for months. Saint Teresa of Avila described visions so intense they bordered on rapture, an angel piercing her with a golden spear, her body shaking with what modern minds might call ecstasy. These weren't simply metaphors. These were spiritual highs, often indistinguishable from what we'd now call psychedelic trips. Visions of glowing lights, floating bodies, time warping, tears of joy, screams, shaking, laughter, nuns weeping uncontrollably for hours, monks collapsing from joy or terror, entire convents bursting into shared religious frenzy. The line between holy and hallucinogenic blurred often. Then there were the plants. In the hedgerows and forests of medieval Europe grew strange allies. Mandrake, belladonna, henbane, datura, names that sound like spells themselves. These plants were often gathered at night, in secret, and mixed into salves or brews. Witches, real or accused, were said to ride through the air after applying flying ointments to their skin, often in places where the skin was thin and absorbed quickly. The ointments caused vivid hallucinations of dancing with the devil, of animal transformations, of flight, but also of terror visions of drowning, burning, or being torn apart. One of the active compounds in these potions, scopolamine, is still studied today for its intense and disorienting effects. There's historical debate, of course, about how widespread these practices were, but the stories persist. Women found naked in fields, claiming they'd flown. Men babbling of otherworldly banquets. Entire villages panicking over witches' sabbaths. Sometimes the drugs weren't taken voluntarily. Take ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. In damp years, it infested grain and turned ordinary bread into something far more sinister. Those who ate it sometimes experienced convulsions, hallucinations, and burning sensations in the limbs, what became known as Saint Anthony's fire. Was it poison, a curse, or a gateway to another realm? Some even suggest that outbreaks of dancing mania, where dozens or hundreds danced uncontrollably in the streets, were caused by this accidental high. Imagine being a peasant, hungry and exhausted, taking a bite of black bread, and suddenly feeling your fingers stretch like snakes, your feet floating above the ground, your neighbors turning into beasts. For many, this was the devil's work. For others, it was revelation. Then there was alcohol, not the mild wine of the Romans, but strong, fermented mead, ale, and strange brews thick with herbs. Monks perfected the art of fermentation, not just to preserve grains, but to experiment. They added wormwood, heather, hops, nettles. Some beers caused deep sleep. Others provoked visions. Drinking was often ritualistic. In some feasts, the aim was not merriment, but disorientation, a deliberate unmooring of the senses, where the line between man and beast dissolved. And sex. We must speak of it, not just as pleasure, but as elevation. In certain heretical sects, sex was believed to release divine energy, to restore a unity lost in the garden. The Cathars, the free spirit movement, and others toyed with wild beliefs that in surrendering to flesh, they escaped it. That orgasm could bring them closer to God, that the body was not a prison, but a key. These groups were often hunted, burned, exiled, but their ideas lingered in secret diaries, in whispered traditions. Pain, too, was a path. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves bloody, not for show but for transcendence. The pain, they claimed, opened doors. Some saints reportedly levitated during such rituals. The ache became a prayer. The body a sacrament. Music played its role. Not just lutes and psalms, but drums, horns, chants. Deep, resonant, Gregorian tones that vibrated through the stone of cathedrals. Listeners wept. Time dissolved. In caves, in castles, in candlelight, the vibration of voice and string carried minds elsewhere. Even the architecture conspired toward this high-vaulted ceilings that made you feel tiny and eternal. Stained glass that turned daylight into kaleidoscopic wonder. Smoke from incense curling through beams of sun-like spirits. It was, in a way, a controlled trip, a curated hallucination. The medieval world was built to be overwhelming, not just in size, but in sensation. Even the language Latin intoned by a priest was incomprehensible to most, but deeply rhythmic. A mantra, a spell. Not all highs were welcome. Madness, possession, visions of hell, these too, were part of the medieval experience. But even then, people didn't always seek to stop the vision. Sometimes they leaned in, asked what it meant, accepted it as truth. And what of love? Courtly love so idealized, so unreachable was its own intoxicant. To pine, to long, to feel one's chest ache with the absence of another, this too was a kind of high. A drug made of poetry, distance, and fantasy. So when we ask what got our ancestors going, what gave them the rush, the escape, the shimmer of something beyond, we see that the answer is everything. Faith, food, drink, song, sex, pain, plants. The stars above and the earth below. The medieval high wasn't bought in a bottle. It was built into life, into the seasons, the stories, the risks. Tonight, as you drift, let yourself feel that reaching, that strange, aching, beautiful yearning for something more. Not because your life is wrong, but because your soul remembers. Close your eyes. Hear the chants echo through stone. Smell the herbs smoldering on a coals. Taste the bitter ale. Feel your breath slow. The world is strange. Always has been. Always will be. And somewhere in its strangeness, you find your peace. They walked through fields not just to harvest, but to dream. Gathering not only wheat, but the flowers that bloomed along the edges. The ones no one planted, but everyone feared. Petals like bruises and stems that bled milky sap. And even then, they knew which ones to chew and which to burn and which to crush into poultices that tingled on the skin or made the heart race or made the world twist gently on its axis. And in quiet corners of small homes they whispered their names. Old names, names with teeth and roots and shadows. And when the children had gone to sleep, they stirred their pots and sang under their breath and waited for the heat to rise, because in the dark, in the silence, something always came. Something ancient, something that leaned close. And the smoke from those pots didn't just rise, it curled. It moved like it knew where it was going, tracing the patterns of spells no one had written down, but everyone remembered when the time came. And they didn't call it getting high, not exactly. But they knew the feeling when it came, The way your fingers forget their fingers, and your thoughts unfold like parchment, and the cold becomes a color, and the candlelight seems to breathe with you. And in that moment, you were not just a baker or a cobbler or a mother or a monk. You were something more, something soft and wide and endless. And then there were the nights, the holy nights, when the stars hung low and the world tilted slightly and they gathered barefoot, eyes wide, listening not to music but to the space between notes, not to prayer but to breath. And the sacred was not found in silence but in repetition, a chant that echoed against stone and time and the bones beneath the floor. And they sang not because they believed, but because belief was something that sang through them, and the walls trembled, and the ground seemed to pulse. And if you were there, if you stood very still, you might have felt it too, the thinness of the air, the stretch of the soul, the place where your name didn't matter anymore. And in this cathedral, or cave, or crumbling barn, the experience was the same. The sense of leaving while staying, of rising without moving, of vanishing into something vast and humming and kind. And then there were the midwives and herb women, the ones who knew what seeds to grind and what oils to mix, who kept little bundles tied with red thread and leaves pressed in books that had no writing, just stains and memories. And they worked with intention, not for fun but for purpose, to soothe, to open, to ease pain or bring visions. R calls sleep, and they knew the difference between a whisper and a warning, between a dream and a door, and they weren't witches until someone said they were. But by then it was too late. The spell had already worked, the mind had already flown, and in the forest, you could sometimes find places where the grass didn't grow quite right, where the air smelled sweet and strange, and if you sat there long enough, you might remember things you'd never known. And it wasn't just the poor who sought this. The kings did too, with their alchemists and secret potions, with their goblets of wine stirred with crushed gems or exotic barks, seeking not just power but something more, something elusive, a way to forget the weight of the crown or the scream of a battlefield or the silence of a poisoned wife. And they paid dearly for those moments of drift, for that glimpse beyond the veil. And then there were the fools, the yesters, the ones allowed to speak the unspeakable, who danced and laughed and drank too much but sometimes said something that stopped the room cold. And they too knew how to escape, to float above the roles and rules, to watch from the edges where everything was clearer. And in their madness there was method, in their wild eyes there was understanding. And the people who saw them perform sometimes left with tears they couldn't explain. And in the villages, the festivals came with masks and drums and dances that made people dizzy, whirling and shouting, and the wine flowed and the bodies pressed close, and for a night the world melted and reformed. And the next morning no one quite remembered how it ended, just that something had shifted, something had been released. And it was the same for the anchorites, the ones who sealed themselves in tiny cells and listened to the world through a slit in the wall, who fasted until the body forgot it was hungry and the mind began to float, who heard the voice of God or the devil or themselves. And when they spoke, people listened, because they spoke slowly and with eyes that had seen things no one else dared to look at. And there were the tales of the green children, of the boys who lived without food, of the maidens who bled golden tears. And maybe these were stories, but maybe they weren't. Maybe they were reports of people who had touched something real and strange and shimmering, and they didn't always live long, but they left behind something more durable than bones. They left behind wonder, and in the monasteries they copied texts that described angels with too many wings and beasts with the faces of men and eyes that saw in all directions. And they believed these visions weren't symbolic, they were literal. And maybe they were right, because in a world where truth was felt more than proven, what mattered was not what happened, but what it meant. And the shepherd boy, alone with his sheep, might feel the wind speak his name, and the mother birthing in a barn might see a light that had no source, and the man dying of fever might rise from his bed laughing and tell of a garden made of sound, and no one would think to question it, because the line between the natural and the supernatural was not a line at all. It was a haze, a shimmer, a breath, and even the skeptics, the scholars, the ones who measured and charted and warned, even they sometimes paused when the room got too quiet or the fire flickered just wrong, and in those moments, they remembered that the world was not built on logic, it was built on story and mystery and breath and rhythm. And in that story there was room for everything, for saints and demons, for ghosts and dreams, for nights where you forgot your name, and mornings where you remembered who you really were. And the medieval high was not an escape from the world, but a way of sinking deeper into it, of tasting its edges and textures, of feeling its heartbeat. And tonight, as you lie still and your thoughts begin to loosen, let yourself drift into that same current, not to flee but to explore, to wander, to wonder, and know that you are not the first, that long before you, in candlelight and forest and song, others too felt this pull, this ache, this strange sweet elevation, and they followed it not because they were lost, but because they knew that sometimes, to truly find yourself, you have to rise. They called it divine fever or sacred madness or the ecstasy of the saints, but what it really was, what it always had been, was the desperate, beautiful attempt to rise above the mud and hunger and cruelty of their days, to touch something that shimmered just beyond the veil. And in their search, they tried everything, and I mean everything, from the rapture of fasting to the thunder of the drums, from bitter roots ground into powder to the breathless stillness of isolation. And they weren't fools or savages or backwards peasants. They were humans like you, with hearts that hurt and minds that needed release. And when life pressed down like a boot on the chest, they found ways to float, even for a moment. And one of those ways was pain, not just any pain, but the kind that opened you, that unstitched the soul, and they understood what we have forgotten, that sometimes agony can become art, and art can become transcendence. And so they whipped their own backs in long lines of moaning penitence, their robes dark with blood and sweat, and they did it not out of guilt, but out of hunger for connection, for transformation, for that fleeting second when the body dissolved and only light remained. And in the cities, far from the silent monasteries and the screaming pilgrimages, they had other methods, more refined, more decadent, more hidden, and the nobles drank infusions made from fermented honey and strange herbs, brought from faraway lands, and some said those drinks made you speak in tongues or remember lives you never lived, and they believed it, truly believed it. And why not? Because the memories came with smells and textures and songs you had never heard but somehow knew. And then there were the carnivals, the feasts of fools, where roles reversed and the beggar became king and the king served wine and the jester preached sermons and the air itself shimmered with absurdity and joy. And under that sacred foolishness was something truer than truth, a glimpse of the world turned inside out. And the laughter wasn't just fun. It was a portal, a spell, a way to let go of the masks they wore every other day, and they let themselves become creatures of joy and sound and movement. And when the night ended and they returned to their normal roles, they did so with the memory of that other world still clinging to them, like confetti in their hair or candle wax on their sleeves. And in small huts and forest clearings and stone-walled keeps, people practiced old rites, not written down, passed mouth to mouth like secrets or songs, and they involved rhythms and circles and fire, always fire, and the beating of drums that wasn't just music but language, a way to tell the bones of the earth that they were listening, that they remembered. And in those moments, spinning and sweating and singing with closed eyes, they entered a different space, a space where the past and present and future folded together like bread dough. And they didn't need to understand it. They just needed to feel it. And they did, again and again. And the high came not just from substances or rituals, but from belief, raw and deep and unshakable belief. Because belief is the ultimate hallucinogen, the most powerful intoxicant. And when they believed that the statue of the saint wept for them, it did. And when they believed that the shadow in the woods was their grandmother or a spirit or a demon, It was, and the mind, that mighty cauldron, bubbled and brewed whatever was needed, and sometimes it spilled over, and sometimes it burned, but always, always, it transformed. And in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, they lit candles and sat still and breathed slow, and they opened themselves to the world, to the stars, to the memory of the world before words. And what they found there was not always kind, but it was always real. More real than the mud or the taxes or the plague. And when the plague came, as it always did, they didn't just hide or flee or fight, they dreamed harder. They saw visions, they heard voices. And maybe that was madness, but maybe it was the only way to stay sane. And the graveyards filled and the towns emptied, but the dreams never stopped. And in the ruins, new rituals were born, made of grief and hope and the strange comfort of repetition, and they clung to them like lifeboats. And some said they saw angels dancing in the ashes or heard songs sung by bones, and some believed them, and some didn't. But either way, the stories spread, and the stories were their air, and even the children knew how to enter trance, through song or rhythm or hunger, and they weren't told to sit still or be quiet. They were told to dance, to listen, to feel, and the world responded. It always did. With wind that whispered and birds that spoke in riddles and dreams that stretched far beyond the bed, and the medieval high was not an escape from reality but a deeper dive into it, a way to taste every part of the world, even the bitter parts, even the sharp ones, and say, yes, I feel you, I see you, I am with you. And as you lie here now, maybe your own thoughts will drift. Maybe you'll feel the hum beneath the silence. Maybe your breath will slow and your skin will tingle and you'll remember something you never lived. And that's okay, that's the point. Because in that space between waking and sleep, between then and now, the same old current runs. And you are part of it. You've always been part of it. And tonight, as the shadows deepen and the stars tilt their gaze towards you, you are not just resting, you are remembering how to rise. They said the body was a vessel, a prison, a test, and also a temple, and also a battlefield, and also the only thing they truly owned until death came to collect it. And in the winding alleys of medieval towns and the windswept fields where peasants bent their backs day after day, people tried to make peace with their bodies, or escape them, or transform them, or punish them into revealing something sacred. And one of the ways they did this was through substances, plants, minerals, fungi, fumes, the whole garden of God and its hidden doors. And though they didn't have chemical names or dosage charts, they had knowledge, ancient and passed down through burned books and whispered tales, and they knew which mushrooms made you laugh, and which made you dance, and which made you see the dead. And they knew that the mandrake screamed when pulled from the earth, not because it had lungs, but because its magic was alive and didn't want to be taken. And they said henbane brought visions, and belladonna brought madness, and wormwood brought dreams. And all of them were both poison and portal, depending on the hand that wielded them. And those hands were often women's hands, worn and calloused, marked by birth and blood and bone-setting and grief. And these women weren't witches. Not in the beginning, they were midwives, healers, keepers of plant lore and pulse rhythms. And they lived on the edge of towns and the edge of power and the edge of knowing. And people came to them in secret, clutching coins or chickens or silence, asking for help with things that priests couldn't fix. And sometimes they left with poultices, and sometimes with tinctures, and sometimes with eyes that saw more than before. And the church feared them, not because of devils, but because of knowledge. And knowledge outside the altar was dangerous. So the women were watched, and then whispered about, and then punished, and still the people came, because pain needs relief, and sorrow needs shape, and love needs risk. And the women knew how to give all three, and in the dark, in stone houses lit by tallow and trembling hope, they brewed things that smelled of roots and ash and salvation, and people drank them, and slept deeply, and woke differently. And not all of them returned to who they were before, and maybe that was the point, because transformation requires a breaking. And in the countryside, there were other kinds of high, the kind that came from fasting for days, alone in a cave, until the rocks spoke or the sky wept light. And they did it not to suffer, but to find clarity. And sometimes they emerged with new names or new eyes or new truths, and sometimes they didn't emerge at all. And that too was seen as a kind of success, a kind of holy consumption. And in the grand halls of castles, the nobles chased different ecstasies, draped in fur and perfumes. They paid jesters not just to mock but to mirror, to show them the absurdity they couldn't admit. And when the jester grew silent, the room grew cold, because laughter was the only language that could say the unspeakable. And they feasted not just on food but on spectacle, on dancers and fire-breathers and mummers who wore death masks and walked backward into the room, chanting riddles and omens. And they said the king who feared the fool feared the truth, and the queen who danced at midnight was closer to God than the bishop at dawn. And when the doors closed and the servants left, the real rituals began, with oils and incense and whispered vows in dead tongues. And maybe it was theater, and maybe it was sorcery, and maybe it was just the oldest longing of all to break the barrier between the seen and the unseen, to peel back the skin of the world and see what pulsed beneath. And even the children knew the feel of the shift. When the room went quiet, and the air thickened and candles leaned towards something unseen, and they knew to hush, and to listen, and not to name what came, because naming gave it power, and sometimes the power was too much, and they spoke of shadow people and watchers and old gods who never left, just hid in the cracks, and in the silence of snowy fields and the endless drone of spinning wheels, the mind wandered, and the wandering became stories, and the stories became truths, and those truths lit fires in the hearts of the lonely and the broken and the brave, and those fires warmed them better than any hearth. And that warmth, that strange, flickering warmth, was a kind of high too, and they chased it, in their own ways, with their own tools, with their own prayers and potions and poems. And it wasn't always safe, and it wasn't always sane, but it was always human, achingly, beautifully human. And tonight, as you lie here with breath slowing and eyes softening, maybe you too feel the edge of that fire. Maybe you hear the echo of that laughter. Maybe you remember something that never happened but still feels true. And if you do, let it be. Let it rise. Let it glow. Because the ancestors are not gone. They are just dreaming through you. In the heart of the medieval world, where silence was a language and shadows stretched long before dusk, people learned that the mind could betray, elevate, or transform, and sometimes all three at once. And so they sought ways to manipulate it, not out of mere curiosity, but necessity. Because the grind of survival was heavy and ceaseless, and if you could not lift the burden, you had to learn to float above it, and so they turned to ecstasies. Not the kind you buy in glass bottles today, but those born of rhythm and repetition, of drums and chants, and the endless swirl of robes in motion. And in monasteries and meadows alike, they danced, and it was not for joy but for release, for communion, for the moment when the self slipped its leash and something older, purer, entered, and they called it the Holy Spirit or madness or the music of the spheres. And it didn't matter which name you chose, because all names were fingers pointing at the same unspeakable truth, that inside us is a place that remembers before memory. And to reach it, they fasted, they twirled, they whispered ancient syllables that had no meaning but carried power. And the power wasn't in the words, but in the saying, again and again, until time softened and thought thinned, and all that was left was the pulse. And in the towns, they had their own rituals. Less sacred, perhaps, but no less potent. And it often began with mead or ale or wine. But the goal was not drunkenness, it was vulnerability. It was connection. It was the dissolving of walls between selves. And so taverns became temples in their own right, with wooden pews and the scent of fermented grain as incense. And the confessions came unbidden. And the laughter too. And the tears. And sometimes the fights, but always the moment when two people looked at each other and saw, really saw, and that moment was worth everything. And in the fields, they found highs in labor, in the rhythm of scythe through stalk, in the sweat that baptized them under the sun, in the ache of muscles that reminded them they were alive. And it wasn't noble or romantic. It was raw and real and vital. And those moments when the body moved without the mind, when instinct took over, were as close to transcendence as anything else. And the priests preached heaven, but the peasants often found it here, in the breathless seconds after a good harvest, or the silent snowfall that blanketed the world and made even suffering feel sacred. And children too found their ways, in games that spiraled into trance, in dares that became demons, in stories whispered so many times they began to manifest at the edges of the room, and the line between real and imagined blurred. And that blurring was a kind of flight. And it was needed because the world was often too sharp, too cruel, too full, and to escape it for even a minute was salvation. And even the animals seemed to know, for the village dogs would howl in harmony with bells and wolves alike, and cats stared too long at things that weren't there, and it made people wonder, maybe the veil is thinner than we think. Maybe it's not a veil at all, but a breath, a blink. And the wise ones, the old women with herbs in their aprons and scars on their hearts, knew how to guide the crossing, not always safely, but purposefully, and they didn't promise healing, only journey. And in those journeys, people changed. And when they returned, they brought stories, and the stories became talismans, and those talismans warded off more than illness. They pushed back despair, and despair was the true plague, the true enemy. And anything that fought it, whether potion or poem or pilgrimage, was worth preserving. And so the knowledge was passed, not in books but in glances, in hands guiding hands, in the tilt of a bow, or the pause before stirring. And in that silent exchange was the oldest magic of all, trust. And trust birthed courage, and courage allowed descent, and descent led to discovery, and they discovered that the world inside was vast and wild and terrifying and beautiful, and that beauty, that terror, that wilderness was mirrored in the stars above. And so they watched the skies too, and when a comet streaked across the heavens, they didn't fear it, they welcomed it. For it reminded them that the divine was not just in churches and crowns, but in chaos, in light, in movement, and maybe, just maybe, in themselves. And tonight, as your breath slows and your limbs grow heavy, feel that comet pass above you, silent and silver and sure, and let it carry your worries for now. Let it be your high, ancient and fleeting and free. In the hidden corners of medieval life, beneath the heavy veils of superstition and stone, our ancestors searched for something more than food and shelter, something deeper than the grind of obedience and the terror of damnation. And what they found, or created, or perhaps summoned, were ways to lift themselves from the earth, if only for a little while. And these highs, these secret departures from pain, were not always sanctioned or safe, but they were essential. And nowhere was this more clear than in the rituals of touch and closeness that bloomed behind monastery walls and market stalls alike. Because even in a world where skin was often a site of sin and danger, there remained a yearning to be seen, felt, held, and through this yearning came ceremonies not of the altar, but of the body, where fingers traced meaning into flesh and glances became incantations. And while the church frowned, the people understood, on some old animal level, that ecstasy wasn't always evil, that rapture could be sacred even without hymns, and that sometimes salvation came not from above, but through another's breath against your cheek. And in the flickering light of taverns and festivals, this played out again and again, a dance as old as dust, where wine loosened tongues and fiddles quickened hearts, and the darkened corners of communal halls became small sanctuaries of escape, not just from loneliness, but from the roles they wore daily like armor. And there were stories, always stories of love found and lost in a single evening, of hands that promised more than the future could hold. And those stories lingered, not as shame but as warmth, and people carried them through winter like embers cupped against the cold. And beyond the realms of passion lay other paths to the edge, to the place where the self began to dissolve into something bigger, stranger, softer, and some sought this through devotion, repeating prayers until the words stopped making sense, and only rhythm remained. And in that rhythm, they floated, their mouths moving long after meaning had vanished, because the body remembered what the mind could not, and others sought it through pain, not because they desired suffering, but because suffering was familiar, controllable, and in its repetition, they found silence, the kind that deafens, the kind that heals, and monks wore hair shirts, not to bleed, but to blur, to erode the boundaries of ego, and pilgrims walked barefoot for weeks, not for penance, but for clarity, because pain, when chosen, becomes something else, something holy. And even in illness there was transcendence, for fevers took them beyond the visible world, into dreams so vivid they felt like prophecies. And when they returned, if they returned, they carried visions stitched into their souls, and people listened, and the stories grew, and so too did belief. And belief, more than anything, was a kind of high, and the market women with their charms and chants knew this. And the shepherds who swore they saw lights in the forest knew this, and the children who spoke to stones and shadows knew this, because the world was not static or sealed. It breathed, it whispered, it invited, and all you had to do was listen differently and see differently. And sometimes they helped that shift, along with herbs, sweet-smelling bundles hung from rafters, bitter powders stirred into broth, slick roots chewed slowly as dusk fell, and the effects varied. Some saw angels, others ancestors. Some saw themselves clearly for the first time, and in a world that rarely afforded mirrors. That was a revelation worth chasing, and in chasing it, they found pieces of themselves scattered in soil, smoke, song, and solitude. And each fragment they gathered became part of a mosaic more truthful than any scripture. And so they danced, they dreamed, they dared, not because they were ignorant, but because they knew, deeply, viscerally, that life without mystery was unbearable. And mystery was everywhere. If you looked slantwise, if you listened between the bells, and maybe that's why so many slept with knives under their pillows and salt at the windows, because they knew what it was to touch another realm, and they both craved it and feared it, and the line between blessing and curse was thin as candle wax, and yet they kept reaching, again and again, because to reach was to live, and to live was to remember that even in filth and famine, there was beauty, in mud-slick laughter, in wild berries that stained the lips of children, in songs hummed beneath breath, in the hush before the first snow. And maybe that beauty, that brief dissolving of weight, was the highest high of all, the kind no one could outlaw, the kind that needed no altar, only presence, only wonder, only breath. In the quietest folds of medieval life, in the spaces between prayers and punishments, there existed strange customs and habits that let the human spirit breathe in a world otherwise so tightly bound by order, fear, and obedience. And these small windows of freedom, of release, were neither celebrated nor often recorded, but they existed with the persistence of moss on stone, always there, soft and inevitable. And perhaps the strangest of these was the high found in surrender, in submission not just to faith or Lord or fate, but to absurdity, to the wild illogic of ancient superstitions that shaped not only how people lived, but how they felt, what they feared, what they chased. And in that chase, something primal was stirred. Because when a peasant tied a pouch of dried mole feet around his neck to ward off nightmares, he wasn't simply deluded. He was participating in an inherited dance with the unknown, a quiet ritual that gave shape to terror and gave it a name that could be whispered or bargained with. And when the baker muttered charms over his oven so the loaves would rise just right, that wasn't nonsense, it was control. It was a breath of power in a world where the wind decided harvests, and the church decided everything else. And in this constant reaching toward magic, The people were building their own invisible scaffolding above the bones of reality, a place where meaning lived on their terms. And it made them feel less alone. And in that feeling was its own kind of intoxication. A swelling in the chest, a momentary lightening of the shoulders, a buzz behind the eyes, and those who lived on the edges, the midwives, the wise women, the healers with dirt under their nails and eyes that never blinked, understood this deeply, and they leaned into it, whispering spells not because they believed every syllable, but because belief itself was medicinal, and they stitched lavender into burial shrouds not just for scent, but for peace, and they taught girls to read the clouds for omens and the patterns of birthmarks as signs, and it wasn't nonsense, not to them. Because when the world was cruel and the sky didn't answer, the ability to name things, to fold reality into something manageable, was everything. And even kings, drunk on power and paranoid from it, often turned to these secret advisors in moments of fear, paying handsomely for roots said to inspire fertility, or stones that kept enemies at bay. Because even behind golden crowns, they were just people, scared of death, of failure, of time, and so they too sought the high of hope, of enchantment, of feeling they weren't at the mercy of chance. And sometimes, when the stars aligned or the wine was just strong enough, that belief manifested into ecstasy, and they'd see visions in the flames of hearths, or feel themselves lifted during chants, and they'd weep, not from sadness, but from the strange fullness of being human in a world that wanted you small. And some took this further, diving into trance, fasting until the line between hunger and heaven blurred, flagellating until the blood became a signal fire to something they couldn't name but could feel. And in this self-abandonment was a strange kind of pleasure, the loss of ego, of fear, the way a river overflows its banks when it's not held back. And you might think this sounds mad, but to them it was clarity. Because madness was sometimes the only honest response to a life so full of contradiction, so they built labyrinths, not just in gardens, but in their minds. Wandering rituals that took hours, days, lifetimes. Each step another shedding of the skin of expectation, and they believed that somewhere in the center was truth, was light, was the thing they could never name, but always chased. And even in music, the music they found transcendence, the way a single flute could turn a tavern into a temple, or a drumbeat could call the old gods back for a dance, if only in memory, and people would sway, not because they wanted to be seen, but because they wanted to disappear. And that vanishing act, that letting go, that moment when you're not peasant or priest or prisoner, but just pulse and breath and rhythm, that was the high. And they chased it in alleys, in chapels, in fields beneath constellations older than time. And when it passed, they'd carry the memory like a song stuck between the ribs. And maybe they couldn't explain it, maybe they wouldn't dare to try, but they knew they'd touched something vast, something kind. And in a world ruled by rules, kindness was a revolution. And revolutions, even quiet ones, leave marks. So if you ever wander through a medieval ruin, pause, close your eyes, press your palm to the stones, and listen. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll feel it, that trace, that echo, that shimmer of a moment when someone long ago stepped out of pain and into wonder, just for a breath, just for a heartbeat, and remembered what it meant to be free. In the marrow of medieval life, far from the battlements and the chants of monks, there pulsed another rhythm, quieter, subtler, but no less potent, and it was found in the small, persistent rituals of escape, in the hush between labor and obedience, where the mind, fatigued from futile repetition, sought refuge not in logic, but in sensation. And that sensation, fleeting, stolen, sacred, was the closest thing many would ever know to ecstasy. And so they built it into their days, with hands calloused by harvest and eyes dulled by sermons, because the high they chased wasn't always madness or divine vision, it was sometimes just difference, a rupture in the pattern, a scent, a song, a moment ungoverned by rule or fear. And one of the strangest ways this surfaced was in their approach to pain. Because unlike modern minds that flee from it, many medieval souls leaned into it, not out of masochism, but because pain was the one thing that felt undeniably real. And in a world where God's will could excuse any cruelty, where the line between justice and vengeance was fog-thin, feeling something that couldn't be debated, like the sting of birch across skin, or the dull throb of a fasting belly, was grounding, affirming, and they used it as a kind of doorway, a way to slip out of the confines of social identity and become pure presence. And monks would whip themselves not just to mimic Christ's suffering, but to reach that eerie floating clarity that hovers at the edge of agony. And peasants would participate in passion plays so vividly that they bled for the performance, not for show but for something. And women, bound by obedience and law, sometimes found strange freedom in mortifying the flesh, plucking hairs until tears streamed or holding ice against skin until they felt themselves vanish into sensation. And in this pain, there was a paradoxical bloom of agency, a whispered reminder that they could choose something, anything, even if it was only the manner of their hurt, and that, in a world of dictated roles, was revolutionary. And this intertwining of hurt and release extended beyond the body, too, into the way they spoke, prayed, and imagined, because medieval stories weren't neat, they were grotesque, surreal, seething with impossible punishments and redemptions, and people devoured them, not because they were moral, but because they were visceral. And listening to the tale of a saint boiled alive or a knight devoured by sin was like stepping into a fevered dream that made your own aches feel less strange, more sacred. And this was another kind of high, this absorption in symbolic pain, where suffering wasn't just endured but transformed into meaning, and meaning, no matter how twisted, was always a form of hope. And then there were the feasts, not the royal banquets of legend, but the local, grimy, glorious ones, where food wasn't just nourishment but theater, and people gorged themselves to the point of collapse, not because they were gluttons, but because for one night they wanted to obliterate restraint, to drown the tightrope of survival in mead and meat and laughter. And there, in the heat and stink and song of a village tavern, people could dissolve into shared madness, into the euphoric relief of not being alone and wanting more. And if someone vomited and danced again, if someone wept into their trencher and then raised it high in toast, that was understood. It wasn't shame, it was release. And above it all, threading through every kind of medieval high, was sound, because in a world without silence, without insulation, the human voice was a portal, and chant was drug, and the drone of a hurdy-gurdy or the trill of a rebeck could loosen something deep inside, something old. And monks knew that is when they layered harmonics in cathedrals to make your bones hum with God. And street musicians knew this when they plucked sorrow into a melody that made beggars dance. And somewhere between the holy and the profane, people found transport in tone, in rhythm, in the tremble of a throat that had nothing left to say but sing. And so they did. And the music moved them out of fear, out of grief, out of memory. And for a moment they were just sound. And that sound was not chained to class or creed or sin, it was theirs. And that fleeting ownership of joy, of transcendence, was so intoxicating that some chased it forever, became wandering bards or hermits who hummed in forests because nothing else ever quite matched it. And if you asked them why they sang, they couldn't say, but their eyes would close and their lips would twitch. And you'd know they were remembering a night when the moon hung low and the strings were in tune and the world, for once, made sense, and in that sense, they were higher than any herb could carry them, because the real drug was connection to each other, to the unseen, to the truth that no matter how much the church preached order or the Lord's demanded service, the soul would seek freedom, and freedom, in its purest form, was not escape, it was expression. The right to cry without cause, to laugh during mourning, to feel everything at once and still breathe. And medieval people knew this in their bones. They just didn't write it down, because you can't script transcendence. you can only chase it. And hope, when it comes, it stays a little longer than last time, like the echo of a song you can't name but will never forget. In the dust-laced alleys of medieval towns and the moss-draped silence of rural monasteries, another kind of ritual unfurled, not in the grand processions of saints or the coronations of kings, but in the tiny, intimate practices of getting lost, of letting go, of temporarily severing the tether to one's burdens and floating somewhere just beyond reach of consequence. And it's here, in these liminal pockets of time and behavior, that we find yet another strange, intoxicating current of medieval highs, not through herbs or chance or pain this time, but through transformation, through the sacred art of becoming someone or something else entirely. And the medieval world, though rooted in rigid hierarchies and eternal dogmas, was obsessed with inversion, with flipping the script, even if only for a day. And this hunger birthed festivals like the Feast of Fools, a time when the lowliest priest might dress as a bishop, when mock masses were sung with irreverent glee, and when laughter was not just permitted but sanctified, and people leaned into the absurd, parading beasts through churches, slathering sacred icons in soot, crowning drunks and dancing barefoot through cathedrals, because for a few blessed hours, the unbearable weight of structure lifted, and in its place came freedom, manic and fragile, but real. And this wasn't mere satire, it was therapy. It was rebellion wrapped in bells and masks, and when the roles reversed and the pauper became pontiff, it reminded everyone, even if only subconsciously, that identity was a performance, a costume sewn from law and luck. And so if you could wear another mask, even for a day, maybe the world wasn't as fixed as it seemed. And in that crack of illusion, in that sliver of unreality, there was ecstasy, and this desire to become bled into everything. Theatricality was the drug. And people chased it not just in feasts, but in pilgrimages, where miles of aching feet led not just to relics, but to reinvention. Because on the road, you were no longer a wife, or a blacksmith, or a debtor, you were a seeker. And in the anonymity of dust and prayer, you could imagine yourself clean, new, worthy, and for many, the journey was the high. The walking away from one's own story into something grander, something holier. Even if the relic at the end was a sheep bone in a gold box, and when they returned, sunburned and blistered, they carried that transformation like a hidden fire, a glow in the bones that said I was not always this, and that knowledge in a world of stasis was electric, and even outside religion. This hunger to morph shimmered troubadours, sang themselves into legends, pretending to be knights and lovers and ghosts, while women in veils told fortunes in borrowed tongues, spinning fate from wax and shadow. And everyone, from peasant child to abbess, knew the thrill of slipping into costume, of adopting a voice not their own. Because sometimes, the only way to endure your story was to borrow someone else's. And in this collective act of pretending, there bloomed something sacred, not deception, but permission. The permission to feel more than one life in your veins. And nowhere was this more intoxicating than in dance, when music crude or divine spilled into the square and people moved, not to impress, but to dissolve, to lose the edge of their self in motion and rhythm, and to feel, even briefly, like air. And this was more than joy, it was trance. And the church feared it, called it pagan or devilish, because it loosened the grip of guilt and rewrote the body as a source of power, not sin. And that kind of revelation was dangerous. And yet the people danced anyway. At harvest, at weddings, at plague funerals. And sometimes the dancing went too far into frenzy, into sickness. But that was part of the thrill, the not knowing where the movement would lead. And when the drums stopped, they collapsed, gasping, eyes wild. And in that stillness, something ancient smiled, because the dance had not been for beauty or show, it had been for release, and the same pulse throbbed in storytelling, when fires flickered and mouths spoke of beasts and saints and crimes, and listeners leaned in, hearts quickened, not because the tales were true, but because they made sense, emotional, moral, cathartic sense, and that kind of sense was rarer than truth. And children heard these tales and dreamed bigger than their hovels, while elders wept for choices not made, and all of it was a kind of drug, not in the brain but in the soul, because it lifted you out of your timeline, into a space where anything could happen, and in that space, you breathed differently, fuller, freer, and maybe, just maybe, you remembered what it was to feel alive, not as a role, not as a label, but as a flickering, fragile, infinite spark, and that spark, passed from chant to feast to tale to touch, is what made the medieval high endure, not as myth or relic, but as truth, as the stubborn truth, that even in mud and fear and ignorance, people still found ways to rise, to reach, to revel, and they did it through the sacred act of transformation, of stepping outside themselves again and again until the boundary blurred and they were not prisoner or sinner or serf, but spirit, dancing in borrowed light. And in that dance, they were more than they had ever been allowed to be. In the chill before dawn, when chimney smoke still clung to the crooked rooftops, and the cocks crowed over streets not yet stirred by feet, there were other stirrings in the minds and bodies of those bound by serfdom and sacrament, a restlessness that no prayer could contain, no crop could quell, and it pulsed with quiet urgency beneath tunics and habits alike, a whispered longing not for salvation or even sustenance, but for sensation, for rupture, for something sharp enough to pierce the monotony of obedience. And here, in the secret rituals and bodily transgressions of the common folk, we find yet another shape of medieval intoxication, not through ale or herbs or ecstasy of the soul, but through the fierce, forbidden worship of the flesh. Because when every hour was accounted for, when every movement was scrutinized by fathers, lords, or God himself, then the body became the last frontier of rebellion, and its cravings the last wild prayers unspoken. And so in back rooms and barns, behind hedgerows and under moonlight, they came together not just for pleasure but for power, because to touch and be touched was to reclaim agency in a world that offered none. And yes, the church preached abstinence and chastity, draped its saints in celibacy and painted desire as the serpent's hiss, but even the sermons could not hush the rhythm in the blood, the throb of muscle and sweat that no incense could mask. And so people met in the shadows, knowing the cost, and gave themselves over to the heat of another's skin, not to sin, but to feel. And it wasn't just about coupling, it was about communion, about the merging of breath and need, about dissolving into something unholy and therefore utterly human. And in those trembling moments, they touched the divine, not through sacred texts, but through moans muffled by straw. And even as they whispered apologies to saints afterward, deep down they knew the truth, that the flesh was not the enemy, but the portal. And for some, especially women, this knowledge was electric, terrifying, and defiant, because their bodies had always belonged to others, fathers, husbands, midwives, magistrates, but in these moments of stolen union, they seized themselves back, became their own, and in doing so, stepped outside the roles written for them, if only for a heartbeat. And that heartbeat echoed in other places too, in the rituals of fertility and harvest, where villagers danced around poles and fires, painted their skin and mimed acts of union, not to scandalize, but to honor the old rhythms, the pre-Christian pulses still buried beneath the altar stones. And sometimes, those festivals turned wild clothes loosened, songs became chants, and the boundaries blurred between rite and riot, and while the bishops raged and scribes denounced, the people kept dancing, because they knew what the clerics feared, that pleasure was power. And in a world where power was hoarded, pleasure had to be hoarded too. At least hidden. And so it seeped into lullabies and riddles, into embroidery and folklore, encoded and disguised, but always there, always humming beneath the surface. And even in monasteries, where walls rose high to keep the world out, the body found its voice in flagellation, in ecstatic visions, in dreams so vivid they left monks gasping, ashamed, aroused, And so they wrote of demons and temptation, not realizing that the devil they feared was the self they had buried, the self that still burned. And this burning found outlet in art too, in carvings of grotesques with protruding tongues, in marginalia that danced with indecency, in stained glass windows where saints wept with longing. And sometimes, even the churches could not hide it, the heat, the ache, the human ache that no incense could sanctify. And this ache became legacy, passed down not in scripture but in sighs, in old songs hummed by grandmothers who once danced barefoot at solstice, in charms whispered by midwives, in the way lovers pressed their foreheads together in haylofts and believed, just for a second, that they were infinite, and that belief, that raw, trembling yes to the body's truth, was its own kind of high, one no potion could rival, and it coursed through them like fire, not to destroy, but to awaken. And when they parted, breathless and spent, they were changed, not cured of suffering, not lifted from poverty, but alive, and that aliveness was enough, it was everything. And so they returned to their fields and chores and prayers, but inside them flickered the memory of touch, of being seen, held, wanted, and that memory was armor, was light, was the reason they could keep walking, even when the road was cold and the harvest failed, because they had tasted something true. And truth, even in secret, was liberation. When the candle's flame flickered low in a room built of stone and silence, when the wind whispered against wooden shutters like a forgotten chant, when the day's toil left the muscles heavy and the mind half swallowed by dream, that was when another kind of medieval high began to rise, not brewed in cauldrons or cupped in palms, but summoned in quiet by rhythm, by repetition, by the slow, soft tick of a thought forming again and again until it no longer resembled thought at all, until it became something more primal, a pulse, a hum, a trance woven not with magic but with motion. Because the mind of the Middle Ages knew suffering, yes, but it also knew how to leave the body behind, how to slip past pain and into something still. And this slipping came not only through faith, though faith was a road often traveled, but through work, through devotion, through song, and the rhythm of that release of spinning wool, of churning butter, of chiseling stone became a kind of doorway, and beyond it was that strange floating place where people said they met angels, or remembered the names of flowers they'd never seen, or cried for reasons they couldn't explain. And it happened more often than we think, more quietly, more universally, and it wasn't always holy, it wasn't always transcendent. Sometimes it was just stillness, but in a world built on noise and suffering, stillness could be as intoxicating as wine, as revelatory as fire, and those who touched it did not always return the same. And in monasteries, that trance was cultivated with purpose. The chanting of psalms, not just a ritual but a rhythm. The rise and fall of Latin syllables blurring into sound, sound into breath, breath into nothing. And monks would enter that void willingly, over and over, until even hunger ceased to speak, and their bodies became only echoes of devotion, vessels emptied to be filled with what they did not name. And outside the cloisters, shepherds and farmers found their own rituals, not codified in scripture but learned through seasons, through watching the sky and walking the same field each day, until the footsteps made patterns the eyes could not see but the soul remembered, and that remembering became a kind of knowing, and that knowing a kind of worship, and that worship a kind of high, one that needed no altar, no incense, only breath and time and repetition. And for women, bound to hearth and harvest and birth and silence, trance came in the form of lullabies, of kneading dough, of combing tangles from hair again and again and again until the motion took over and the world fell away. And they would sit for hours, eyes unfocused, lips parted, minds floating in some middle space between memory and nothing. And no one spoke of this, not because it was shameful, but because it was common, as water was common, as dusk was common. And like water and dusk, it carried power ancient and unseen. And in the cathedrals, The architects chased trance too, not just with prayers, but with precision, with geometry, with the impossible mathematics of light. And those arches and windows were not just stone, but invocation, designed to bend thought upward, to stretch the mind toward awe. And the people who stood beneath those ceilings, peasants and princes alike, would often weep and not know why. And in that weeping was trance, was surrender, was the body remembering it was more than flesh. And even executioners, grim in their duty, found themselves haunted by rhythm, the swing of the blade, the drumbeat of the crowd, the heartbeat of the condemned. And in that rhythm, they too sometimes saw visions, heard voices, not always welcome, not always gentle, but always there. And in those visions came another kind of intoxication, not of bliss, but of certainty, the cruel seduction of knowing one's role in the grand, brutal order of things. And the certainty itself became a drug, hard and sharp and strangely comforting. And in the villages, trance was summoned through drums and dance, through spinning circles and chants older than the language they were sung in, and people would fall trembling, laughing, crying, not possessed, not mad, just freed, even if only for a breath. And that breath was enough to carry them through another winter, another plague, another burial. And the church tried to contain this, to name it heresy or hysteria. But the trance lived deeper than doctrine, nestled in the marrow of being, and could not be cast out with holy water or fear. And in time, even the saints learned to speak of it, of floating, of light, of voices like bells in the bones, and their visions were not just madness but maps, guiding others toward the sacred wildness that lived just beneath the skin of the world. And so the people kept moving, kept spinning, kept singing their low, long songs, and the songs echoed through valleys and over hills, winding into the dreams of those yet unborn. And those dreams carried the memory of the trance, and the memory became story, and the story became truth. And in that truth was the last and oldest high, the one that required no herb or touch or miracle, only the willingness to fall inward, to surrender to the beat beneath the breath, to lose the self and find, in its place, the endless silence from which everything comes and to which everything will one day return. In the quiet corridors of medieval consciousness, where pain and prayer walked hand in hand, and the rhythm of survival shaped the very texture of thought, there existed another kind of intoxication, one not born of herbs or visions, but of power, raw and concentrated, delivered not in secret but in ceremony, in decree, in the slow unfolding of hierarchy like a sacred map etched into the bones of society. And those who stood highest in this order, who wore crowns and held scepters, they too were seekers of a high, but theirs was not ecstatic or spiritual. Theirs was the rush of dominion, the soaring euphoria of command. And it came not through bloodshed alone, though there was plenty of that, but through ritual, through spectacle, through the silent, shared agreement that one man's word could bend 1,000 backs and still be called holy. And in this twisted liturgy, kings found a kind of trance, a kind of escape, a sensation that blurred the boundary between divine and human until they truly believed they were both. And this belief, this divine delusion, was cultivated with care, from the architecture of thrones built high and cold, to the robes heavy with meaning, to the language of decrees that read more like psalms than law. And every gesture was choreographed, every breath a proclamation. And in that performance lay the high. Because it was not just about ruling, it was about being seen ruling. And the gaze of the court, the obedience of subjects, the endless bowing and scraping became a mirror, reflecting back an image so grand, so unassailable, that the king began to see only that, and not the man beneath. And in that illusion he floated higher and higher, until even God became a peer rather than a master, and the church, ever alert to such blasphemy, tried to bind this ascent with doctrine, with coronations and anointings and holy oils that reminded kings their power was borrowed, not born. But the most cunning rulers turned even that to their advantage, claiming the oil proved their blood was sacred, their will divine. And once a man believed he was chosen not just politically, but cosmically, he needed no other drug. For what could wine or herb or touch offer that compared to the sensation of reshaping the world with a word? And this reshaping took many forms. War declared with the flick of a ringed hand, lovers discarded or crowned with equal ease, forests raised for pleasure gardens, taxes levied to build monuments to vanity, and all of it justified, sanctified, euphoric, and those around the king, the courtiers and whisperers, the poets and jesters, knew how to feed this high, how to offer flattery so refined it felt like truth, how to mask manipulation as homage. And in this courtly theater, the king was always center stage, always bathed in light, always the object of worship, and like all addictions, this too demanded more and more and more. And when reverence faltered, when enemies grew bold or subjects restless, the withdrawal was brutal, and kings lashed out not just with armies, but with terror, with spectacle, with executions designed not merely to punish, but to prove they were still gods in flesh, still worthy of the high. And in this proving, they often slipped into madness. But even madness, when cloaked in velvet and lit by torchlight, could pass for majesty. And so the dance continued, century after century, throne after throne, and even the most enlightened monarchs, the philosophers and patrons and warriors of vision, were not immune, for power, once tasted, alters the palate forever, and the taste of being above is unlike any other, subtle at first, like smoke or shadow, then overwhelming, like fire. And beneath this hunger lay another truth, one darker, quieter, whispered only in dreams, or by fools, that many kings were not high at all, but hollow, their grandeur a mask, their commands a cry, and beneath the gold and titles beat a heart like any other, frail and afraid, but trained never to show it. And so they chased the high not to ascend but to forget, to drown the terror of being just a man in a world that expected a god. And in this drowning they found a strange kind of peace, a silence thicker than prayer, and in that silence they sometimes heard their own name, not the one given in ceremony, but the one they'd buried, the one that trembled when alone, and when that name rose, they drank deeper, ruled harder, built higher, until no one could see the man anymore, only the mask. And the mask smiled, and the world bowed, and the high endured. In the dimmest corners of medieval life, far from the altars and castles, beyond the feasts and the fields, there existed a peculiar form of elevation not granted by God, nor earned through labor, but stumbled upon in shadow, in ritual, in the strange concoctions and older-than-memory traditions that slithered between Christian piety and pagan memory. And it was in these margins that people sought not just escape, but transformation, a chemical, herbal, or sensory rewiring that lifted them from the monotony of mud and hunger and silence and placed them, if only briefly, in a world where the veil between flesh and dream thinned, where the body could transcend its aches and the mind could forget its fear. And among the common folk, whose hands were calloused and eyes always cast downward, the high came not in gold goblets, but in brews passed down through oral chains of knowledge, in infusions of belladonna, henbane, mandrake root, and other herbs that did not simply numb the pain but twisted reality, distorted time, blurred the edges of the self until even the sky seemed reachable with one's breath. And these were not recreational endeavors, for the concept did not exist. These were acts of survival, of psychological alchemy, wherein suffering became sacred and hallucination a form of prayer. And in the silence of night, in the corners of candlelit hovels or deep within forest groves where the church dared not look, groups gathered, not always witches, though some would be called so, but seekers, herbalists, grandmothers with cloudy eyes and boys too young for war but too old for play. And they partook together, passing clay bowls or leather flasks, speaking words in half-forgotten dialects, invoking spirits not with fear, but with need. For when the world you live in grinds your spine and steals your children, even demons become companions. And the visions came, slow and writhing, green flames licking air, animals speaking truth, ancestors arriving in whirls of smoke to offer cryptic wisdom or terrifying silence, and the body would move, often without command, writhing or stilling in ways that frightened the uninitiated, and the high was not joyous, nor was it agony. It was raw, immersive, primordial, and when it left slowly, like fog leaving a field, and the return was bitter, like falling from grace. And for days after, some would weep, others laugh uncontrollably. Many say nothing at all, just stare and wait for the real world to feel less sharp. And over time, these gatherings became less frequent, more dangerous. The churches are each tightening, suspicion rising, and the knowledge began to decay, rotting at the edges like a scroll left in rain, until only fragments remained, passed down in whispers, in symbols etched onto spoons or hidden in embroidery. And the high that once lifted them to realms beyond was replaced with silence, fear, and wine dull, predictable wine and in cities. As trade expanded, new substances arrived, powders from the east, syrups from the south, and with them came new kinds of elevation, elegant, expensive, reserved for the merchant class and the idle rich, who could afford to blur their edges not with dirt-rooted hallucinations but with imported refinement, and thus began a division of highs, those of the elite, scented and served with silver spoons, and those of the desperate, brewed in secrecy and swallowed with trembling hope. And in this divergence was born the myth that only the poor craved escape, that elevation was the indulgence of the weak. But this was false, for the need to be lifted from oneself is universal, and the king who drinks until his words slur is no different than the peasant who chews roots until her hands forget grief. And somewhere in between, there were those who sought not the herb nor the chalice, but the flesh, who found their high in sensation, in the collapse of inhibition, in the dim corners of inns and the curtained alcoves of brothels where pain and pleasure danced in ritual patterns. And they too were seekers, perhaps the most honest, for they did not veil their yearning in incense or prayer, but named it, fed it, let it devour and redefine them. And the church saw this too and called it sin, built penance around it, crafted shame into its very language, but could not eradicate it, for the hunger was deeper than dogma, older than scripture, and it pulsed in the hearts of every pilgrim and plowman, every widow and monk, every lonely soul who looked at the stars and asked not for salvation, but for release. In the quiet descent of twilight over cobbled lanes and thatched roofs, where the last smoke of hearths curled toward dimming skies, and the streets grew still except for the whisper of cloaks brushing past shuttered doors, there lived another kind of craving, one less spoken of but no less real, a hunger not for food, nor coin, nor salvation, but for sensation, for that flicker of something beyond the slow, dull throb of medieval life. And this hunger was not always filled with herbs or brews or the touch of skin, but sometimes with something stranger, deeper, more abstract, like rhythm, like trance, like the surrender of the self to movement and sound. And in this realm, the human body became its own vessel, not lifted by substances but by momentum. And though the church frowned upon dance as vanity and music as temptation, still they danced, in secret and in circles, in woods where the moonlight dappled the moss and the owls did not judge, and they spun until the air itself bent around them, until time dissolved and the self became a blur. And this too was a high, as raw and sacred as any potion. And some say the saints themselves once danced, before they were saints, when they were just people, trembling and aching like all others. And the hunger also found its way into rituals, festivals, where the veil between the living and the dead was said to thin, nights when masks were worn and fires were lit and everyone, for just a few hours, could become something else, something freer, something not bound by rank or sin or sorrow. And here too, the high was communal, collective, a shared madness that blurred class lines and gave permission to scream, to cry, to laugh too loudly. And these rituals, though wrapped in religious calendars, held older roots, roots that pulsed with memory and magic, and the people felt it, even if they could not name it, and so the craving endured, passed from generation to generation, not as a doctrine but as a need. An itch beneath the skin, a knowing that there was more than this world, or at least more than what the world permitted them to see, and in darker corners, the hunger grew more dangerous, more desperate, leading some to test the bounds of death itself, to drink from skulls, to sleep in graves, to summon forces they did not understand, not for power, but for transformation, for proof that the soul could step outside the cage of the body and glimpse something truer. And some never returned, their minds shattered, their eyes empty, and their stories became warnings, and still others chased the high anyway, because even madness seemed preferable to monotony. And in this space between curiosity and recklessness lived the alchemists, the visionaries, those who believed that the body contained within it the keys to the divine, and they fasted, meditated, bled themselves, starved themselves, whispered secrets to fire, and listened for answers in smoke. And whether they found truth or illusion mattered little, for in their seeking they found movement, and that movement was itself a kind of grace, and among them were the dreamers, those who claimed to walk beyond this world in sleep, who visited kingdoms of light or realms of torment, who returned with symbols etched into their memory, and whether real or imagined, their journeys became maps, and the people followed, and thus dreams, too, became a form of intoxication, a nightly portal to what could not be tasted or touched but only felt, and it was this unyielding pursuit of something more that defined the medieval high, not as a thing to be taken, but as a state to be chased, again and again, through plants and prayers, through dance and desire, through silence and song. And in this endless reaching, the people of that time were not so different from us, for even now, with all our lights and labels, we still crave the high, still seek the moment when the self dissolves and the world blurs, and something inside us says, yes, this is what I was made for. In the dim corridors of memory where ancient echoes settle like dust on old stone, we come now to another shadowed chamber of medieval life, one where the high did not come in the form of drink or ritual, but rather through the act of believing so deeply, so wholly, that belief itself became its own intoxication. And here, in the embrace of unwavering faith, people found themselves lifted beyond the agony of the everyday, beyond the fields and filth, into a realm shaped not by what they saw, but by what they hoped. And this hope was not soft, not a gentle flicker, but a raging fire that demanded sacrifice, demanded submission, demanded everything, and many gave it, and in doing so, felt something sublime, something terrifying, something pure. And so we arrive at the phenomenon of holy ecstasy, not the metaphorical kind, but real, physical, collapsing to your knees kind, the kind that made women speak in tongues and men weep blood, the kind that made the church both revere and fear its saints. And to witness it was to see a body seized by invisible flame, to see eyes rolled back and limbs trembling and words spill forth that no mortal teacher could have taught. And in these moments, the ecstatic became untouchable, unreachable, suspended somewhere between the flesh and the divine. And whether they were prophets or madmen, witches or visionaries, no one could say for certain, but all agreed that they had gone somewhere the rest could not follow. And when they returned, if they returned, they brought back words and warnings and sometimes silence so profound it ached. And the high of holy ecstasy was one of contradictions born of deprivation, yet lush in sensation, sparked by isolation, yet performed before crowds, feared as heresy, yet celebrated as miracle, and those who chased it often paid dearly with their health, with their minds, with their lives, and still the hunger endured. and it found fertile soil in the hermits and anchorites, those who bricked themselves into cells the size of coffins and called it liberation, who lived off crumbs and rainwater and dreams, and who claimed that in the stillness they heard the voice of God, and whether or not that voice was real, it filled them, moved through them like fire in their veins, and they were never cold again. And for others, the high came in martyrdom, the ultimate surrender, the blood-soaked path to sainthood, where pain was not only endured but welcomed, where the stake or sword became not a punishment, but a gateway, and crowds gathered to watch, not just in awe, but in envy. For to see someone step so fearlessly into death was to glimpse a kind of freedom that no earthly pleasure could offer, and thus suffering itself became a form of elevation, and pain a sacrament, and we might recoil at that now, wrapped in modern comforts and explanations, but in those times, when every day hurt in some small way, the idea that pain could mean something could lead somewhere was a balm more potent than wine. And so they bled and burned and knelt for hours on frozen stones, not because they were broken, but because they believed it would make them whole. And perhaps it did. And outside the convents and cloisters, in the bustling chaos of cities, there were others who sought the high not in solitude but in spectacle, in relics paraded through streets, in incense thick as fog, in choirs that rose like thunder, and in the majesty of cathedral light. They felt something lift inside them, something wordless and warm, and for a moment, just a moment, they were no longer hungry. And this too was a kind of intoxication, not of the body but of the soul. And while we might label it now with science or skepticism, to them it was real and powerful and necessary. And so we return again to the core truth that runs beneath every chapter of this story, that the people of the past, despite their ragged clothes and brutal lives, were no less alive than we are, no less in search of meaning, of wonder, of escape. And their methods, though strange to us, were rooted in the same soil as ours, a longing to feel more, to be more, even if just for a breath, a beat, a blink. And in that longing, they found their high. And in their high, they found something like peace. In the flickering torchlight of forgotten abbeys and the cold shadows of crumbling stone walls, there existed a kind of rapture that did not come from above but from within, rising not through divine visions or whispered prayers, but through the rhythm of movement, the ritual of sound, and the surrender of the self to something primal, something that bypassed the thinking mind and settled in the marrow. And this form of medieval high came in the shape of ecstatic dance, of frenzied motion that blurred the lines between pain and pleasure, devotion and delirium. And though we may struggle to imagine it now, in an age ruled by structure and symmetry, there were times when entire villages lost themselves in motion, arms flailing, feet stomping, mouths crying out in languages not learned but felt. And this was not performance, not entertainment, but release, a desperate shaking off of the chains that bound their days. And at the heart of it all was the phenomenon we now call the dancing plague, a strange and terrifying outbreak that swept through towns like wind through wheat, compelling people to dance until their feet bled, until their bodies broke, until their hearts gave out. And though no one could explain why it happened, not then and not fully now, those who were caught in its grip described a sensation unlike anything else, as if their limbs moved of their own accord, as if the world had melted away and all that remained was rhythm, pulsing and insistent. And some called it a curse, others a punishment, others still a divine intervention. But beneath the theories and fear lay a truth, that for the dancers, for a fleeting, fevered span, there was only the now, the moment, the beat, and in that moment they were free. And there were places where such rapture was not feared but sought, in festivals and rites that turned the world upside down, where the fool became king and the devout became wild, and masks were worn not to hide but to reveal, to show what lived beneath the surface of everyday obedience. And in these carnivals of inversion, people tasted a kind of joy so raw it burned, a kind of pleasure so sharp it cut, And when the day ended and the masks came off, something lingered, a buzzing in the chest, a looseness in the soul, and though life returned to its rigid lanes, the memory of that high endured. And in certain secret corners of the world, rituals persisted that danced dangerously close to the edge, blending sacred and profane in ways that made the church uneasy but the participants ecstatic. Rites of fertility and fire, rites of blood and breath, where the body was not an enemy to be tamed, but a vessel to be filled, and the filling came through chant and heat and sometimes pain. And while these practices often lived in the margins among the heretics, the pagans, the wild women of the woods, they spoke to a hunger that crossed all boundaries, a desire to feel, fully and fiercely, and in feeling to transcend, and even in the quiet of monasteries, that hunger found form, not in dance but in repetition, the slow, steady recitation of prayers, until the words lost meaning and became music. A drone that lulled the self into forgetting, into slipping sideways into something vast and quiet. And this too was a kind of high, one that did not explode but expanded, a dilation of time and thought, until the monk no longer knew where he ended and God began. And while to the outsider it might seem like madness or monotony, to those within it was the most delicious surrender. And so whether in the wild stomp of peasants, or the whispered chant of cloistered souls, the people of the Middle Ages pursued altered states with a tenacity we often overlook, and it was not just escape they sought, but elevation, not just distraction, but transformation. And these transformations left marks on their bodies, on their songs, on their stories passed down like holy relics. And though time has weathered the names and faces, the pulse remains, steady beneath the surface of history, reminding us that he yearning to be more than flesh and duty, to taste something beyond the dust and sweat of daily life, is not new and not lost. In the remote hills and forested edges of the medieval world, far from the watchful gaze of the clergy and the orderly rules of the towns, there existed pockets of belief and practice that had never truly died out, merely gone underground. And in these places, our ancestors sought highs not through wine or song, but through nature herself, through the ancient, trembling rituals of folk magic and herbal ecstasy. And though the church had declared such things heresy, even witchcraft, there were those who remembered the old ways, passed from grandmother to daughter, from hermit to apprentice. And those ways spoke of plants that opened the mind, of roots that whispered in dreams, of mushrooms that showed visions not of heaven but of something older, something rooted deep in the soil and in memory. And there was a reverence in these acts, a sense that to touch the Divine One did not need to build cathedrals or wear robes, but merely listen to the rustle of the leaves, to the shape of a stone, to the silence between bird calls. And so they brewed their teas, and ate their bitter caps, and smeared strange ointments on their skin. And when the stars wheeled overhead and the fire crackled in the clearing, they danced not for others, not for show, but for the forest, for the earth, for themselves. And the sensations they described were not unlike flight, or drowning in honey, or becoming a tree, rooted and vast and humming with life. And such experiences, though feared by outsiders, left them with the sense of connection that no sermon could offer, a knowledge that the world was alive. And so were they, fully, brightly, terrifyingly, and it was not always joyful. Some visions brought pain, or memories that did not belong to them, or the shapes of things best left unseen, but still they returned, again and again, because even the pain was real, and to feel anything that sharply was to be reminded of their own existence. And in a world where life was short and brutal, where war and plague could come without warning, such reminders were sacred. And so they continued, beneath the moon, beneath suspicion, beneath history's eye, and their descendants would be called witches, burned or hanged or forgotten, but the memory of their highs lives on, echoed faintly in folk tales, in the symbols etched onto old wooden spoons, in the lullabies that mention herbs and shadows and dreams, and elsewhere, in the great halls and royal courts. Another kind of high was taking root, one more sanctioned, more gilded, but no less potent, and it came not from plants or blood or movement, but from power, pure and addictive, and the kings of the age, those crowned men wrapped in velvet and fury, found their ecstasy not in the ecstasy of others, but in control, in bending reality to their will, in commanding death and being obeyed. And this too is a kind of intoxication, one as old as empires, and just as dangerous. For once a man has tasted the thrill of absolute authority, of altering lives with a glance or a word, he does not easily return to simplicity. And so they surrounded themselves with flatterers, jesters, spies, with those who fed their appetite for dominance. And like any addict, they needed more, always more land, more subjects, more fear. And sometimes, when the night was deep and the torches burned low, they would whisper of angels and destinies, of divine right and holy order. But behind the incense and the silk was the same hunger, the same desperate need to feel something that proved they were more than just men, more than just animals in clothes. And in this way, the kings and the witches were not so different, both reaching, fumbling, yearning for something beyond the grind of breath and bone. And this reaching shaped the world, etched into it 1,000 stories of light and dark, sacred and profane, and those stories are still with us. In the way we speak of madness, of genius, of vision, in the way we seek escape in books, in screens, in moments of stillness that break open the ordinary. And though we no longer smear mandrake on our skin or chant to the stars, the desire remains, flickering quietly beneath our rituals of productivity and progress. And perhaps that is why we look back, not just in curiosity but in envy. Because for all their hardship, our ancestors knew how to fall out of themselves, how to risk the unknown for a taste of something truer. And we, so armored and rational, so careful and clean, have almost forgotten what that means. In the final stretch of our long and quiet journey through the strange highs of the medieval world, we must now turn our gaze to the strangest high of them, all the high of belief, not in plants or drinks or status, but in the weightless certainty that one's suffering had meaning, that pain itself was holy. And in this, the medieval world reached its most exquisite and terrifying elevation. For while many sought escape in herbs or feasts or the rush of violence, others found their ecstasy in surrender, in denying the self so fully that the boundary between body and soul dissolved. And nowhere was this more vivid than in the lives of saints and penitents, and those who took to the road not to flee but to find, wandering barefoot through mud and frost, eyes bright with hunger and hope, wearing chains as belts and sleeping on stone, convinced that the aching of the flesh was the key to touching the divine. And though we might recoil now, might wince at the thought of whips and hair shirts and fasts that turned men into shadows, to them these were not horrors but invitations, ways to leave behind the heaviness of the world and rise, not in body, but in spirit. And rise they did, or so the stories say, levitating in cathedrals, glowing with invisible fire, speaking in voices not their own, and while many watched in awe, others whispered of madness, of pride, of possession. For the line between saint and lunatic is thin, and thinner still when one seeks to dissolve it entirely. And yet the desire was the same, to feel something more than the grind of toil, to find a pulse in the silence that spoke not of the world but beyond it. And they found it in visions of bleeding Christs and weeping virgins, in the taste of ash and the sound of bells, in the long stillness of cloisters, and the sudden glory of revelation. And though their highs left no bottles or powders, they left marks on parchment, in sculpture, in the songs of monks that rise like smoke from stone walls even now. And these marks remind us that the body was never just a vessel but a battlefield, and in that battlefield some found triumph not through conquest but through surrender, through the exquisite pain of letting go. And outside the monastery walls, the people watched, puzzled or inspired or afraid, and some tried to mimic the saints, crawling to shrines on bloodied knees, clutching relics with trembling hands, believing that to touch a bone was to be touched by God. And in this belief they found warmth, purpose, the kind of dizzying certainty that can fill the emptiest of bellies, and this too is a kind of high, the high of being chosen, of being seen by the invisible, and it wrapped around them like smoke, like breath in winter. And for a moment they were not poor or sick or broken, but holy, radiant, part of a story that stretched from creation to apocalypse. And in that story, even their pain had weight, their suffering a rhythm, their tears a song. And so they returned, year after year, to the places where the veil felt thin, to the mountains and the groves and the crumbling chapels, not for healing but for meaning. And meaning, once found, was more potent than any wine, and just as addictive, and perhaps the cruelest high of all, came to those who gave up everything for it and felt nothing, who fasted and wept and walked for miles and met only silence, and they carried that silence like a wound, a hollow space where the divine should be. And in their despair, they touched a different kind of transcendence, the terrible high of emptiness, of knowing the world offers no answers and loving it anyway. And so we end where we began, with a people reaching, always reaching, with mud on their feet and stars in their eyes, hungry not just for bread, but for something that made the bread worth baking. And though their methods seem strange or brutal to us now, the hunger is familiar, the longing sharp and shared. And in their strange, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying ways, they remind us that to be human is to seek, to fall, to rise, and sometimes, if only for a moment, to fly. In the winding corridors of medieval life, long after the sun dipped behind the hills, and the prayers of vespers faded into the stone of the abbey walls, another kind of hunger stirred in the hearts of common folk and kings alike, not the hunger for bread or even for salvation, but for something stranger, something harder to name. A kind of intoxication, not brewed in barrels or whispered in confessions, but felt in the marrow, the skin, the heat of being alive in a world that offered little comfort and much mystery. And in that space, where cold winds whispered through shutters and the stars seemed impossibly far, people reached for ways to feel more than what the earth allowed. And among these, few were stranger or more revealing than the rituals of the body that pushed people into states of ecstatic frenzy, half spiritual, half bodily, like the dances of the flagellants who whipped themselves through towns, bloodied backs glistening in torchlight, crying out not in agony but in joy, as if pain could lift them out of the muck of their lives and carry them to something pure, or the Feast of Fools, when the world turned upside down and bishops wore jester hats and choir boys ruled the altar, laughing and mocking and weeping with laughter, drunk not only on wine but on the giddy freedom of unmasking everything sacred for one day. And while the church grumbled and frowned, it never truly stopped these things, for even it knew that sometimes the people needed madness to survive the sanity of their toil, and so these rites continued, strange and vivid and filled with a kind of desperate joy, a high not unlike the flicker of flame in a pitch-dark barn, gone too fast but unforgettable. And there were stranger things still, whispered about in corners, like the love cults that flourished under cover of devotion, where women and men claimed to have visions of Christ not as Savior but as lover, swooning and moaning in their cells, their writings filled with longing so intense it bordered on the erotic, and it was not blasphemy. To them, it was closeness, it was transcendence, and perhaps the strangest high of all came not from herbs or wine or even prayer, but from transformation. The feeling of stepping outside oneself and becoming something new, something terrifying and divine, as in the ecstatic possession of the demoniac or the holy fool, who wandered the streets barefoot, muttering prophecies and eating nothing but grass, and people threw stones or bowed in reverence or both, unable to decide whether they were seeing madness or miracle, and often the two danced hand in hand, just as they still do now. And amid these highs, bodily, spiritual, emotional, ran the deeper current of story, of myth, of shared belief that told each peasant and potter and page that their pain was not pointless, that the aching in their knees and the tremble in their bellies meant something, and in that belief lay a heady power, a narcotic of the soul. And though it left no scars like the whips or stains like the wine, it lingered in the mind and the breath, in the way people stood taller after a vision or a festival or a miracle. And though their world was hard and brief, marked by loss and mud and hunger, it was also rich with strange peaks, where the veil grew thin and a shepherd might speak with angels, or a nun might glow with light no candle had made. And these stories, true or not, became real in the telling, passed from mouth to ear to parchment, woven into frescoes and carved into bone. And each retelling gave them new life, new weight, a kind of communal high that spanned generations. And this too was how they soared, not always with their bodies, not always with herbs or wine, but with words, with belief, with the shared intoxication of meaning in a world that often gave none freely. And it is in this that we may still find echoes of them, in our own strange rituals, our festivals and dances and songs, in the ways we, too, reach for more than the grind of work and days, for more than food and sleep. And in those reaches, we may understand that they were not so different, our medieval ancestors, not so alien or crude, but human, terribly and beautifully human, reaching with open hands toward the stars, toward God, toward themselves. There is something strangely beautiful about the final hours of a medieval day, when the torches are lit and the sky turns the color of hammered iron, when the fields fall silent, and the only sound is the low murmur of prayers, or the creak of a cartwheel fading into darkness. And in that hush, in that thick velvet stillness, our ancestors dreamed, not just in sleep but in waking moments too, and those dreams took strange forms, vivid and wild and utterly human, because when the world offers you so little comfort, so little safety, you begin to make your own heaven or your own madness. And often the line between the two vanishes entirely, and what we see now as superstition or delusion was, to them, a kind of medicine, a balm for the aching body and the restless soul. And in those nighttime hours, after work was done and danger slept lightly, they turned inward or upward or toward each other. And the highs they sought were often quieter than we imagine, less the blaze of festivals and more the hush of shared stories, the slow burn of candlelight over parchment, the murmur of lips tracing psalms that had no beginning or end, and the soft warmth of another body beside you when the frost was thick and the fire low. And there were darker highs too, ones we would not call beautiful, but which still mattered. The feverish ecstasy of flagellation, the bloodletting of guilt and absolution, the way some found transcendence in denying themselves until they shook with hunger and saw visions in the cold. And these were not anomalies, not edge cases, but part of the fabric of that world, woven into its music and medicine and myth. And even in the silence of the monasteries, highs were pursued through silence itself, through the absolute surrender of the self in prayer that lasted hours or days or years, through the belief that the soul could float upward like smoke and kiss the feet of angels. And in cities, in alleys, in brothels and bathhouses and back rooms, other kinds of highs unfolded, bodies oiled and perfumed, skin against skin, the heat of touch, not just for pleasure, but for power, for control, for something unnameable that made the poor feel rich, the weak feel strong, the forgotten feel seen. And these moments, too, were rituals of elevation, of transformation. And though they often ended in shame or pain or disease, still people returned to them again and again, because the high was real, even if the world said it wasn't holy. And in that, we see something essential, something eternal, that the human need to feel more than flesh and earth, more than toil and loss, is not weakness, but hunger, not sin, but striving, and it's in that striving that history breathes, and if you listen closely, you can hear it still, not in the echo of sermons or the clang of swords, but in the quiet places, the flicker of candlelight against stone, the soft gasp of a woman alone in her cell, writing words that glow with desire and devotion, the laughter of boys mocking priests behind cathedral walls, the whispered recipes of root and herb passed hand to hand in markets, and in all of it, this pulse, this drumbeat, this need to rise, to lift, to escape the flatness of survival and step for a moment into something bright, even if it burns, even if it doesn't last. And perhaps the truest high of all was this, the moment of forgetting hunger, forgetting fear, forgetting that tomorrow held war or plague or famine. And in that moment floating, flying, freed, however briefly, from the weight of time. And so when we ask what got our ancestors going, what made them smile or dance or cry or kneel, we must look not only to their churches or their feasts or their wars, but to their hearts, to the secret places where they stored their cravings and their hopes, and where, against all odds, they found ways to feel fully, truly alive.